When you think of NFL legends, names like Joe Montana, Barry Sanders, and Lawrence Taylor may come to mind. But there's another category of unforgettable figures, not just for their talent, but for their fire, feuds, uncompromising edge, and sometimes outright hostility toward opponents, media, or even teammates. These are players whose intensity transcended the field, whose reputations were built as much on conflict as on athleticism. Today, we're ranking the 10 most bitter players in NFL history, not simply the toughest, but those whose careers were marked by rivalry, resentment, internal tension, and moments that left fans, media, and sometimes teammates shaking their heads. Now, before we dive in, smash that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more deep NFL breakdowns. Whether you agree, disagree, or think someone is missing from this list, stick around, this is one you'll want to weigh in on. There's no way to explore bitterness without starting with 10. Warren Sapp. One of the most dominant defensive tackles of his era, Sapp was a force of nature on the field, and a lightning rod off it. He played with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and later the Oakland Raiders, but his attitude stirred controversy throughout his career. Sapp was known for trash talk that could unsettle opponents, and he often feuded with offensive linemen who tried to challenge his dominance. But bitterness, in Sapp's case, also spilled beyond the gridiron. Even after retirement, he made headlines for confrontations with media and fellow Hall of Famers, and he became part of a larger conversation about player conduct and accountability. What made Sapp bitter wasn't just confrontation, it was his unwillingness to back down from it, even when it cost relationships. At 9, we have Randy Moss, one of the most electrifying receivers in NFL history but also one of the most volatile. Moss could single-handedly change games with speed and catch radius that seemed supernatural, but high. Coming in at 8 is Rex Ryan, a defensive mastermind whose bitterness was more about rivalries and pride than personal feuds. As head coach of the New York Jets, Ryan relished battles with Tom Brady's Patriots, famously promising to knock the *****ing Patriots off their perch and sparring publicly with Bill Belichick. Ryan's Jets teams were built on defensive swagger and a willingness to go toe-to-toe with the league's best, and while he wasn't a player, his persona and bitterness towards certain franchises, especially New England, made him one of the sports at 7 we find Tel Owens, a wide receiver whose talent was undeniable but whose attitude kept him constantly in the headlines. Owens played for the 49ers, Eagles, Cowboys, Bills, and Seahawks, and each stop featured a mix of brilliance and controversy. He clashed with teammates like Randy Moss, ironically on the Eagles, and his celebrations, including the infamous Sharpie signature in the end zone, drew the ire of opponents and the NFL alike. Owens didn't just harbor bitterness toward rivals, he often directed it internally, clashing with quarterbacks and criticizing coaching decisions publicly. Love him or hate him, Owens' intensity and willingness to speak his mind made him one of the sport's most polarizing figures. Breaking the top 5, at 6, is Brett Favre, perhaps the most conflicted bitter legend of all. Favre's career with the Green Bay Packers was defined by toughness, he rarely missed games, but also by a streaky temperament that occasionally spilled into clashes with media and teammates. Favre's most notorious bitterness was part of his retirement saga, where he announced retirements and returns multiple times between 2008 and 2010, creating tension with the Packers organization and fans. At 5 we have Deion Sanders, primetime himself, one of the most charismatic athletes ever to play football. Sanders was a two-sport star, playing both MLB and NFL, but his confidence often crossed into blatant arrogance that rubbed opponents and sometimes even teammates the wrong way. Sanders was a shut-down corner who wanted to be hated, he thrived on trash talk, flamboyant celebrations, and a belief that he was bigger than the game itself. That attitude served him well in many ways. He helped win Super Bowls with the 49ers and Ravens, but it also made him one of the most divisive figures in league history. At 4, we step into territory where bitterness intersected with physicality and rivalry, Charles Haley. A Hall of Famer known for relentless pass rushing with the San Francisco 49ers and Dallas Cowboys, Haley was the ultimate competitor, someone who hated losing more than he loved winning. That intensity often manifested as hostility, to the point where teammates and coaches sometimes struggled to manage his fire. His emotional outbursts were as legendary as his 6 Super Bowl rings, and while he's rightly remembered as one of the most impactful defenders ever, Haley's bitterness sometimes made him a difficult presence in the locker room. Now we approach the top 3 players whose bitterness became part of NFL lore. At 3 is Bill Romanowski, a linebacker whose name became synonymous with hard hits and hard edges. Romanowski played 16 seasons with the 49ers, Eagles, Broncos, and Raiders, earning Super Bowl rings and a reputation as one of the most feared defenders in the league. But his bitterness toward opponents and willingness to engage in controversial on-field behavior at 2, we find a name that every NFL fan knows when you mention resentment and rivalry: Lawrence Taylor. Taylor is one of the greatest defensive players in league history, a force of nature whose arrival in the 1980s transformed defensive schemes across the league. But Taylor wasn't just Dom. And finally, at **1, the most bitter player in NFL history, we have Terrell Suggs. Suggs wasn't just a fierce pass rusher for the Baltimore Ravens, he was the embodiment of edge and resentment toward opponents. Known for trash talk, emotional intensity, and unforgettable feuds, Suggs' career was defined by his desire to dominate and defeat rivals in ways that went beyond strategy. His repeated battles against division foes like the Steelers became personal wars. Games where Suggs wasn't just playing for a win, but for bragging rights and revenge. Suggs' competitive temperament and occasional confrontations with opponents, officials, and even some coaches make him a fitting choice as the most bitter player in league history, not because he lacked heart, but because his fire was as much a part of his identity as his playmaking ability. But let's be clear, bitterness doesn't necessarily mean villainy. In the NFL, intensity is often the emotional fuel that drives greatness. In many cases, what fans perceive as bitterness is really unmatched competitive drive, a refusal to yield, and a mindset that sees every opponent as someone to be conquered. These 10 players were not just hostile, they were memorable. Their conflicts brought out the edge that separates the good from the unforgettable. Their feuds gave us narratives that transcended seasons. Their bitterness was part of their competitive DNA, and it's why we still talk about them years later. If this video helped you see the other side of NFL greatness, the fire, the intensity, the rivalries, take a moment to like, subscribe, and share with friends who live and breathe football. Bitter may be the word, but passion is what we remember. Now I want to hear from you. Who do you think should have been on this list but wasn't? Which NFL player had the most intense, most bitter presence you've ever seen? Drop your answer in the comments below.